Hey, if you have a Bible, we're going to go to Mark 9. We've been walking through the book of Mark really since the beginning of February. And we've moved around a little bit because we didn't want to disregard the global celebration of Palm Sunday and Easter. And so we've done a little more chronological movement, not as much time travel as the Avengers, but we've done a little bit in the last couple months. And so we've been in those first few chapters. We got to chapter 8, and we sprung ahead to Palm Sunday, and I'm taking too long to even intro what's going on here. But so today, for the sake of you being here, let's look at chapter 9 here in a minute. I've said before that, that nothing like using your iPad and then it just like it. It's okay. It's going to be fine. I'll keep introing. The fact that as we look at Scripture, in the book of Mark, in the Gospel of Mark, it's divided kind of evenly. The first 8 chapters, Jesus is revealing who he is as the Son of God, as the Christ. And the pivotal chapter is 8, where he says, who men say that I am? And they said, people say this and that, and then he says, who do you say that I am? And Peter says, you're the Christ. You're the anointed one. You're the king who was promised to restore all things. And then you know what happens from there, or if you don't, you can go back and read that. But what begins to happen is a bit of a change from the standpoint of, from there on, Jesus is explaining what he's come to do. So he establishes in the first 8 chapters, this is who I am. And for the next 8 chapters, he establishes his purpose. And those guys struggle with this quite a bit because he's telling them, the Son of Man must be rejected. The Son of Man must suffer. And oh, by the way, he's going to be killed. That's me. That's what he's saying when he's telling them the Son of Man. But here's the good news. He's going to rise on the 3rd day. That's the part they keep forgetting. So we'll kind of pick up there that, Peter rebukes him and some things like that. And now Jesus began revealing more details about his mission and more explicit on what it means to even follow him when he says, follow me. And so he called people to follow him, but now he's painting a little more of a vivid picture of what following will entail. And so he's going to take up his cross. And so today I want us to see, he keeps talking about taking up your cross. He's going to take up his cross. And he's going to correlate today as we look at this story, this reporting of what happened with Jesus, of the cross and glory. And he's also going to show us how the cross and his glory work in our lives together. You can't have one without the other. It's a good thing. Sometimes we struggle. We just want the glory part, right? Glory. That's even fun to say. And so, yeah, go ahead and say it with me. Glory. Yeah, all right. Yeah. I can tell there's a little participation going on today. So Mark 9, verse 2, let's pick it up there. After 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him and led them up on a high mountain where they were all alone. There he was transfigured before them. His clothes became dazzling white. And then he makes this comment, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them. They didn't have Tide, didn't have Cheer. They had Jesus. Whiter than anyone could bleach them. And there appeared before them Elijah and Moses, who were talking with Jesus. And Peter said to Jesus, Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters. One for you, one for Moses. He had to explain to Jesus because like he wouldn't know. And one for Elijah. And here's the little parenthetical thing. He says, he did not know what to say. They were so frightened. Peter always has to say something. The other 2 guys didn't, but Peter always needs to. And then a cloud appeared and enveloped them. And a voice came from the cloud. This is my son, whom I love. Listen to him. And suddenly, when they looked around, they no longer saw anyone with them except Jesus. Now, we're going to read more of this chapter 9 in a minute. But centuries prior to this event, according to the book of Exodus, in the Old Testament, God came down on Mount Sinai in a cloud. And the voice of God spoke out of that cloud, and everyone was afraid. Sound a little familiar here, right? Moses went to the top of the mountain and he begged to see God's glory. It's found in Exodus 33, 18 through 23. I'll just read a little portion of it. Show me your glory. We were singing that today. You know, show me your glory. Your infinite greatness and unimaginable beauty. And God responded, when my glory passes by, I will put you in a cleft in the rock and cover you with my hand until I've passed by. But my face cannot be seen. No one may see me and live. Now, this is important. So, Moses was not able to see God's glory directly, but even getting near was enough to make Moses' face shine. Talks about that. You can read about that more in Exodus if you're interested. And it reflected the glory of God for a period of time when he came off the mountain. In this, centuries later here, what we're reading here, we're on top of another mountain, and there's glory again. And this dazzling brightness makes Jesus' clothes whiter than anyone in the world could even bleach them. So there's a mountain, there's a cloud, and there's even Moses makes an appearance here. Is this Mount Sinai all over again? No. I'll tell you why. Because there's a big flip that's going to happen here. There's a twist that happens. Moses had reflected the glory of God as the moon reflects the shining of the sun. But Jesus produces an unsurpassable glory of God. It just emanates from him. Jesus does not point to the glory of God as Elijah and Moses and all the other prophets had done. Jesus is the glory of God in human form. The author of the book of Hebrews puts it this way in Hebrews 1:3. The Son, Jesus, is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being. They're one and the same. Something else happens here that never happened on Mount Sinai. Peter, James, and John are in the presence of God, and yet they do not die. You ever read this and wondered about that? They're there, and they don't die. On Mount Sinai, God came down as a cloud. It was called the Shekinah glory for those Old Testament people that like really fun words. Shekinah, that's a fun word. The Shekinah glory came down in a cloud. And you remember in the Holy of Holies, and the high priest would go in once a year to make atonement for the sins. And, you know, it was the raw presence of God, which the Israelites knew was fatal. You couldn't be in his raw presence and live. When God told Moses, no one can see my face and live, he was saying there is an infinite gap between deity and humanity. You can't take my reality, is what God was saying. Remember, you can't handle the truth. God says, you can't take my reality. Remember, reality and truth are the same thing, essentially. So, you can't take my reality. God's saying, you can't endure the presence of my holiness. My glory would destroy you. And this is why here on the mountain where Jesus is transfigured, the Mount of Transfiguration as it's called, Peter is scared. How many times have we seen this as we've been reading through Mark? Fear, immediately something happens. Peter's scared, but he's scared witless. So he says something, I mean, we read it and we go, well, that probably made sense. No. He's so scared he stammers out, Rabbi, let us put up 3 shelters. Oh, it's really good that you let us be here, by the way. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. And that's a little bit of a baffling proposal, especially when it says, when your translation says shelters. It's like, oh, let me build you a house. We're going to be here a while, I guess. But let's explore this thought just a minute. The word translated shelters here is actually the Greek word for tabernacle. See, after God's glory came down on Mount Sinai, the Hebrew people built a tabernacle. Why did they do that? Well, most religions have recognized that there's a wide gap of some kind between deity and humanity. And therefore, Many religions have temples, tabernacles. We see it all around the world. They have priests and have sacrifices and rituals to transform for your consciousness, or to take away your sin, or to meditate, and to mediate the gap, to protect human beings from the divine presence of whatever deity, in this case, the God of the universe. What Peter's actually saying here is we need a tabernacle. We need to set up some rituals to protect us from the presence of God. We've got to have a buffer here. And immediately after Peter says this, a cloud appears. God intervenes and envelops Jesus and Moses and Elijah. And from within this glory cloud, the Shekinah glory, God says, "This is my Son, whom I love." Listen, our foundation is on the love of God. Whom I love. Listen to him. Listen to him. And they are in the very presence of God. Yet Peter, James, and John they do not die. How could that be? Why is this? Suddenly, when they looked around, it says, they no longer saw anyone with them except Jesus. That's Mark's way of saying, I believe Moses is gone, Elijah is gone, and Jesus is the bridge over the gap between God and humanity. He is it. Those guys, they came to bear witness. He's the one. And Jesus is able to give what Elijah couldn't give, what Moses couldn't give, what no one else could deliver. Through Jesus, we can cross the gap into the very heart of reality, the truth. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. What Moses couldn't give. We enter into the steps of, as C.S. Lewis calls, the dance. Remember several weeks ago when we introed, we were reminded that the Son had been in perfect union, perfect relationship with the Father and the Spirit, always giving glory to one another. Something that's hard for us to even wrap our brain around. And Jesus has come. The good news, Jesus has entered our fallen, sinful world, our sinful state, to do for us what we could not do, to offer himself, to pay a price, the one who did not owe, so that through his actions, his sacrifice, his dying and rising again, that he could change our status forever. Repent and believe the good news. That was the very beginning of Mark. So, this good news, Jesus is able to give what none of the other guys. Jesus is the temple and the tabernacle, and to end all temples and tabernacles. Because he is the sacrifice to end all sacrifices. He's the ultimate priest, the one who made a way where there was no way. When the cloud comes down, not only do the disciples not die, but they are surrounded and embraced. I want you to catch this. They are surrounded, embraced by the brilliance of God. I believe the cloud enveloped all those guys. It doesn't say specifically. We tend to think it just enveloped the glory dudes, right? But he took those guys up there for a reason. And we're going to see more here in just a minute. That they were embraced in the very brilliance of God. They hear God the Father speaking of his love for the Son, just as he did when Jesus was baptized at the beginning of Mark. And suddenly the cloud goes away. And they're left standing there, kind of probably blinking in the comparatively dim light of where they are now on the mountaintop. How many like mountaintop experiences? Who doesn't, right? Here they are on the mountaintop in a state of just wonder. What just happened? What just happened? James, Peter, and John have experienced worship. I'm going to suggest to you, they've just experienced worship. Worship is a preview of the thing that all of our hearts are longing for, whether we know it or not. We're hardwired. We are created to worship. Every one of us. People, some of the most godless people you've ever met in your life. Try not to conjure them up right now, but we're all created to worship. to give our hearts to something. It may not be, here's my heart, Lord, but here's my heart, whatever it might be. You know, we heart everything. You get the bumper stickers, right? But we're created. And God, in coming in human flesh as a sacrifice to redeem us and buy us back, has come to reveal what we were made to really worship, to be restored, to give our hearts fully to a King, the King of glory. So we look for it. We look, you know, we look for worship even when we have not come into the fullness of knowing the gospel. We seek it in art in our culture. We seek it in music. We seek it in romance. We seek it in the arms of lovers. And we seek it even in our family. In his most famous sermon, The Weight of Glory by C.S. Lewis, he says this, and let me just read a section. I'm recovering from a cold, so my throat is raspier than normal today, so let me go here. Lewis says, the sense that is in this universe, we are treated as strangers. The longing to be acknowledged, to meet with some response, to bridge some chasm that yawns between us and reality is part of our inconsolable secret. And surely, from this point of view, the promise of glory becomes highly relevant to our deepest desire. For glory means good rapport with God, acceptance by God, response, acknowledgement, and welcome into the heart of things. The door on which we have been knocking all of our lives will open at last. Then our lifelong nostalgia, our longing to be reunited with something in the universe from which we now feel cut off, to be on the inside of some door which we have always seen from the outside, is no mere neurotic fancy, but the truest index of our real situation. At present, we are on the outside of the world, the wrong side of the door, but all the leaves of the New Testament, he says, are rustling with the rumor that it will not always be so. Someday, God willing, we will enter in. Now listen, Jesus has come to be that way. And so when he tells us this, that's different language than we use every day. I love those guys that wrote back, all those dead guys. And Lewis puts it in a way, you may need to go back and read it, find The Weight of Glory and read it yourself. Worship, let me just say this. This is something we can all understand. Worship is not just believing. Before they went up on the mountain, Peter, James, and John already believed in God, didn't they? I want you to think about this. And Peter had already said, you are the Christ. But now they have sensed it. The presence of God has enveloped them. They have had a foretaste of what Lewis says all of us are longing for. The very face and the very embrace of God. Imagine the scene afterward. Think about this. Imagine the scene afterward when the echo of God's voice is sort of faded. And the disciples must have had a dozen questions, or maybe a couple hundred dozen, I don't know. Mark recounts what happens next. And so in Mark 9, starting in verse 9, let's continue to go there. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus gave them orders not to tell anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. They kept the matter to themselves, discussing what rising from the dead meant. And they asked him, why do the teachers of the law say Elijah must come first? And Jesus replied, to be sure, Elijah does come first and restores all things. Why then is it written that the Son of Man must suffer much and be rejected? Jesus keeps reminding them of what's going to happen. But I tell you, Elijah has come, and they have done to him everything they wished, just as it was written about him. As they come down from the mountain, Jesus instructs the disciples, don't tell anybody until the resurrection. I mean, why is that? Well, the full meaning of the episode would only be apparent of the resurrection when that occurs, because the transfiguration is a glimpse. It's a preview of the resurrection and even the second coming of Jesus that's talked about in the end times in the book of Revelation. Also, until the resurrection, who in the world would believe it? He's kind of sparing them a little bit here. One thing is clear to the disciples, though. By speaking of this resurrection here, Jesus is again pointing to his death. There's no resurrection without death for anybody. Remember that when Jesus told them, I'm the Messiah, but I'm going to suffer and die, Peter rebukes Jesus. And here again, Peter and the others kind of push back, but they do it in a little more of a cagey, sly manner this time. Why do the teachers, so we don't think about it. When you just read this along, if you don't think about what's going on here, they say, why do the teachers of the law say Elijah must come first? In the Old Testament book of Malachi, prophesied that Elijah would return before the great day of the Lord. You can read about that. It's the last book in the Old Testament, when God will appear and make everything right. So the disciples are saying, hey, we just saw Elijah up there with you, right? And the day of the Lord must be near. What is all this talk about death? I mean, Elijah's here, and Jesus just lays him flat. He says, I tell you, Elijah has come, and they have done to him everything they wished, just as it is written about him. Jesus is saying the Elijah that the prophet Malachi was pointing to was John the Baptist. And he has suffered and died. Elijah has come and gone, and he repeats, Jesus repeats here, it is written that the Son of Man must suffer much. And just as Elijah's coming was a herald of the Lord's coming, so Elijah's execution, John the Baptist, he was beheaded by Herod, if you need to recap that, as a herald of the Lord's execution. When Jesus was baptized, in the opening chapter of Mark, when we looked at that, the Spirit descended on him like a dove. And the Father spoke his love, and it fortified Jesus to begin teaching and healing publicly, to begin his public ministry. And now, at the Mount of Transfiguration, the Father envelops him with his presence. And the light of the Shekinah glory and the voice, again, to fortify him, to fortify Jesus for a far greater test that awaits him as he moves resolutely now towards Jerusalem, towards his execution on the cross. And it's not only Jesus. Now, this is what I want you to catch. It's not only Jesus who's strengthened by this experience on the mountaintop. How many of you, when we go to the mountaintop, we get fortified, right? Whatever reason you go there for. Check out, make sure your forerunners, whatever. You get a little built up. Yeah. But God knows, Jesus knows, that Peter, James, and John need this experience as well to fortify them for what's about to come. The test that they will face when their leader is taken from them. Have you ever had that kind of experience? I want you to think about this with me for a minute. Our life is not to be built. Our life of following Jesus is not to be built on experiences, but at the same time we don't throw them out. So I want to see the balance here today. But have you ever had the kind of experience when the compassion and the love of another person helped you deal with your suffering at that moment? Just think about that a minute. Have you ever had the kind of experience when someone's unconditional approval and their encouragement transformed your fear into a resolve? I can think of times with people when an encounter with beauty seemed to neutralize the anxiety and give you hope in a situation. And I want you to think about it. If you got that kind of help more often, wouldn't you be different? That kind of help. Wouldn't trouble make you wiser, deeper, maybe stronger, instead of bitter and hard and joyless? Wouldn't suffering make you more compassionate if you got that kind of help, rather than more cynical about human nature in general? Wouldn't failure be more likely to be productive in your life? Of course it would, if you got that kind of help, if you had that kind of help available. But here's the question this morning. It's for all of us. How are you going to get? How are you going to get more of that kind of approval, that kind of encouragement, that kind of unconditional love without burning out all your friends and family around you? I want to look at the bigger picture here. We need it. We would be better. But how do we get that consistently without burning out? I mean, we've all had that friend that looks to us for all those things I just explained so they can make it through whatever they're through. And it about kills you. And we have to draw some boundaries. How can we do that? The answer for us, as it is for the disciples, it was here for the disciples, is worship. It's worship. That almost sounds too simple, doesn't it? You must have access through worship to the very presence of God. You have to see clearly in your mind that God has done what he's done through Christ and is doing through Jesus currently. We need the experience, the foretaste of that embrace that God is going to give us someday face to face. I didn't mean to rhyme like that, but you need to actually sense what you know of God's love. It's one thing to be told. I want you to think about this. It's one thing to be told that somebody is remarkably beautiful or attractive. It's one thing to be told that. You believe it. Somebody told you and you trust them. They said, oh, you've got to meet this person. They are the most attractive person I've ever seen in my life. But when you actually see him or her, you say, oh, wow, they're striking. What just happened? Did you get new information when you saw them? Nope. You're experiencing what you already knew, what somebody already told you. Let's bring it, maybe that sounds too creepy, but so let's take it to a restaurant. Take it to a restaurant. Somebody tells you it is unbelievable. Somebody you trust, they say, it's the truth, man. It is the gospel truth. This is the best food I've ever had in my whole mouth, right? It's the best. And you believe what you're told, but when you go there and you eat, you're just blown away. Did you get new information? Nope. You're experiencing what you already knew to be true. Are you with me? It's one thing to know that the glorious Creator God loves you, cares for you, holds you. But it's another thing to sense it, to experience it. Whatever life brings you, you will need those foretastes to nourish, to fortify, and strengthen you. Worship is important, friends. The transfiguration is not just some miraculous parlor trick to convince the disciples of Jesus' deity. It is an experience of collective worship that they're going to need for what's ahead of them. Remember, God always gives us what we need. We always think he's out to give us what we deserve. He's always out to give us what we need. It'll always be on his terms, by the way. Worship. Let's talk a little more about this. How then can we have access to the presence of God in that kind of way? How can we have these foretastes? Jesus and the disciples are barely off the mountain before, we're going to read some more of this, chapter 9, before he gets the chance to show us how to make our way into God's presence. So Mark 9, starting in 14. When they came to the other disciples, remember the guys that got left behind? They came to the other disciples, they saw a large crowd around them, and the teachers of the law arguing with them. And as soon as all the people saw Jesus, they were overwhelmed with wonder, as we should be, and ran to greet him. What are you arguing with them about? He asked. A man in the crowd answered, Teacher, I brought my son who is possessed by a spirit that has robbed him of speech, and whenever it seizes him, it throws him onto the ground. He foams at the mouth, he gnashes his teeth and becomes rigid. I asked your disciples to drive out the spirit, but they could not. See the big arguments going on here among the teachers of the law, the crowd of people, and the disciples that didn't get to go to the mountain to worship. They're trying to exorcise a demon, and it's not working. Evil, let me just say, evil is present and everybody's confused. That ever happened to you? Again, Mark takes the existence of a demonic activity. We've seen it throughout the book of Mark, of a continued battle, if you will, against evil, personal, supernatural beings, as a self-evident aspect of reality, a fact of life. Not everyone, by the way, is personally possessed. Don't elbow your neighbor by a demon like the boy in this story. But Paul says in Ephesians 6, you want to go read that later on, that we are all fighting, not against flesh and blood, but against demonic principalities all the time. Remember that even Jesus was not immune to the attacks of the demonic. Matter of fact, the prince of demons, back in Mark 1:12, after his baptism, right after the first fortifying goes on, God speaks, the Father speaks, and the Spirit descends, was in the desert for 40 days being tempted by Satan himself. Back to this story. The boy in the story is possessed by a demon, making him deaf and mute and causing convulsions. This would be horrible. It's overwhelming physical and spiritual condition that not only renders the boy helpless, but it also causes problems from everybody around him. His dad, in this case, the disciples and the teachers of the law, they're all stymied by what's going on here. The story continues, Mark 9:19. Jesus is really compassionate here, and he starts out and he says, "Oh, unbelieving generation, how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you?" I don't know how he said it exactly. That's how I would have said it, but here we see compassion kick in. Bring the boy to me. So they brought him, and when the Spirit saw Jesus, when the Spirit saw Jesus, it immediately threw the boy into convulsion. He fell to the ground. He rolled around, foaming at the mouth. Jesus asked the boy's father, "How long has he been like this?" "From childhood," he answered. "It has often thrown him into the fire or the water to kill him. But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us." Lord, have mercy is what he's saying. If you can do anything, have mercy on us. Take pity on us and help us. If you can, said Jesus. If you can. Everything. Everything. He didn't say some things. He says everything is possible for him who believes. And immediately the boy's father exclaimed, "I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief." And when Jesus saw that a crowd was running to the scene, even more people, he rebuked the evil spirit. "You deaf and mute spirit," he said, "I command you to come out of him and never enter him again." There's no incantations. He just speaks with authority. And the spirit shrieked, convulsed him violently, and came out. And the boy looked so much like a corpse that many said, "Well, he's dead." But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him to his feet, and he stood up. And after Jesus had gone indoors, his disciples asked him privately, "Why couldn't we drive it out?" And he replied, "This kind can come out only by prayer, communing with God. Your authority's got to come from somewhere other than you. The fortification, the nourishment that you need has to come from outside of you, guys. It'll come from the inside out, but it's got to come from another source, and you can't do it. Disciples are trying to exorcise a demon, and they've been trying, and they've done it without prayer, and they're just being arrogant and clueless, and he gets a little frustrated with them. Their inadequacy to deal with the evil and suffering of the world is what we run into. The disciples tried prayerless exorcism for the same reason they couldn't understand why Jesus had to die. They weren't in the agenda that God was trying to give them. They were still operating in their own agenda. They didn't see how weak and proud they were. They underestimated the power of evil in the world, in the broken world we live in. It's real. I mean, we could say if we don't talk about it, it's not out there. That's a lie. That's denial. And also the evil that was in themselves. The teachers of the law are there too, and they're probably criticizing the whole thing. Only one figure in this entire scene that we're reading about here is acknowledging his weakness, admitting that he does not have what it takes to handle the suffering and the evil that he faces. It's the father of the boy. And this man asked Jesus, would you heal my son? And Jesus says, everything is possible for him who believes. And that is, I can do it if you can believe in me. And the father responds, I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief. How many times have we read this? That is, I'm trying, but I'm full of doubts. And Jesus heals the man's son. This is very good news. That's why the gospel is the good news, not some news that you just got today along with all the other garbage, but the good news. It's not what you can do, it's what he has done. Very good. And through Jesus, we don't need perfect righteousness. And what I mean by that, he's come to give us righteousness, but we don't need perfect performance. If I would just do this right, if I just at this time, if I do this and make sure, that begins to be a ritual, and it begins to be something that we can't accomplish on our own. It's from the outside in instead of from the inside out. We just need repentant helplessness to access the presence of God. He doesn't want to leave us there, but when he finds us there, he is willing to give us what we need. Jesus could have told the man, hey, I'm the glory of God in human form. Purify your heart. Confess all your sins. Get rid of all your doubts and your double-mindedness. And by the way, once you've surrendered to me totally, then you can come before me and be pure in heart, and you can ask me, and then I'll do. No, Jesus doesn't do that. Jesus doesn't say that. Not at all. The boy's father says, I am not faithful. I'm riddled with doubts. And I cannot muster the strength necessary to meet my moral and spiritual challenges. But help me. That's saving faith. That's faith in Jesus instead of faith in one's self. What I think and what I feel and what I want. Perfect righteousness is impossible. Perfect performance is impossible for us. And if you wait for that, you'll never come into the presence of God. You'll never come into the presence of God. You must admit, we must admit, that we're not righteous on our own by what we've done, and that you need help. And when you can say that, you're approaching God to worship. And you know what happens when as we walk out our faith and we get a little haughty and a little high-minded, and we get caught in something, and we're going to, not admit, and then we're caught in a trap. But he's got the power to release us. He's got the power to bring us back to the mountain, because he's conquered all of it. We must admit, we cannot leave this scene without an acute awareness of what Jesus is about to lose. He has lived endless ages in the glory of the Father and the Spirit in this dance. On the mountain, we see Jesus surrounded by God the Father. On the cross, we see him, he will be forsaken. On the mountain, we see the life that he has always led, embraced and clothed with love and glory, the light of God. But on the cross, he will be naked and in the dark. Am I right? Why did Jesus put himself through that? He did it for us, friends. It was my sin that nailed him there. He did it for us. Paul tells us clearly that evil is unmasked and defeated on our behalf at the cross. He had to go there. They were not picking up the clue phone. He had to go there. He writes in his letter, Paul writes in his letter to the Colossian church that Jesus disarmed, Colossians 2:15, Jesus disarmed the power and authorities, triumphing over them by the cross. That's how it had to happen. There wasn't any plan B. And on the mountain, through the Spirit, God was strengthening, fortifying Jesus for his mission, for the infinite suffering that he would endure to defeat all evil, every bit of it. And God can empower us in the same way to face evil and to overcome our own suffering. You may know in your head today that God loves you, and that's good. But sometimes the Spirit makes it especially clear to you that is the case in a specific manner. Sometimes you go to the mountain. Sometimes through the Spirit you can hear God make a statement of unconditional, permanent, intimate love. Sometimes you don't just know about God's love, but in your heart you actually hear God saying, "You are my daughter. You are my daughter. You're my son." I would go to the infinite cost, infinite depths, not to lose you. And I have. Sometimes we just need to hear Jesus say that. Worship, spending time experiencing what we already know, is intentionally putting ourselves in the path of God. Sometimes it's coming together as a corporate body to offer our hearts and to be reminded, even where we started this morning with that call to worship, remember His faithfulness. Remember, because in the midst of the evil, in the midst of the broken world, we forget stuff. I do. Maybe you don't. And I need those times to remember what I already know, but being embraced, surrounded by the glory of God. I got to experience a portion of that twice today. Just coming together in worship. This week, people don't even want to be around me. I pull out music from 20, 30 years ago to have my own time, to put myself intentionally in the path of God so that I can experience what I already know. Listen, our walk with Jesus is established on truth. Build my life on truth. Speak what is true. Here's my heart, Lord. Speak what is true. But oh my, when we enter in, when we give opportunity to worship through prayer, maybe singing back to the Lord, whatever it is, hear Him singing over us, reading His Word and giving it time to digest, not just reading my devotional so I can get out the door, so I can know more stuff. Please, please, please don't do that. Ask Him, unveil my eyes, unveil my heart. Oh God, I want to experience your glory. Show me your glory. And you don't have to worry about dying, because Jesus died in your place. He is the glory of God. Worship. And we could talk about what all that looks like. But if we just go to Romans 12, because of what He's already done, because of His great mercy, offer yourselves as living sacrifices. Here's my heart, Lord. That's your reasonable service of worship. Amen? Is it? Now, listen. Don't get beat up by this. Move toward it. Maybe we need some hunger. Maybe we need to act on that hunger of what we already know we need. When you've pursued God in a repentant helplessness, you will have worshiped. And every time you sense His embrace, your soul will shine just the slightest bit brighter. And with His reflected glory, you'll be just the slightest bit more ready, fortified to face what the broken world has to throw at you tomorrow and the next day. Please do not reserve worship for whatever Sunday I might make it to church with everybody else. Oh, wait, I got to come at 9:30 next week. No. I get to come next week at 9:30. Right? But take those times. Maybe it's in your car. Maybe it's in a room. Maybe it's set aside time, not just to read some more information, but to expect the living God to speak and embrace you, to experience what you already know. He knows you best, and He loves you most. Unbelievable. That's our God. I want you to stand with me this morning. I want to do something I don't normally do. I want to ask you just to close your eyes here for a minute. Right there where you are. And I just want to ask you a couple questions. I want to pray over you. I'm going to give opportunity for more prayer in just a little bit. But as you've heard about this picture of worship to fortify us for what's ahead. And the enemy wants to come and say, oh, yeah, you've not been doing that. You just tell him to shut up right now. But I want you to listen to what God's telling you. And maybe just admit more of your need. Maybe you'd say today, I need to grow in my desire to draw aside and have those times where I seek the glory of God. Worship, personally. I want that. If that's what you want today, would you just raise a hand, and I just want to pray for you. I just want that. I just want a greater desire to meet with the King of Glory, to be fortified. Okay. Listen, the reality is we all have those times where we're running dry, we're running on empty, and we think we didn't stop and fill the tank at all this week. You cannot live from just Sunday to Sunday, or even worse, coming together for corporate worship twice a month or whatever our schedule says to us. But I want you to think, and I want to pray for you that God will give you just that desire and that hunger to seek out times with God on your own. That prayer, that worship. You can't deal with these things without prayer. See, prayer is part of worship. It's part of communion with King Jesus by the Spirit, based on the truth of His Word. So the truth and the Spirit are always in agreement. And so, Father, I pray right now for these that just have admitted their need, that they need more of you, that they need greater hunger in their heart to even have that desire to meet with you. You would just spur that in them, that you just ignite that. And God, through their helplessness and through their obedience, to come to you, the only living God, the one who's wired us to worship, but you're the only one worthy. Lord, that we would begin to develop more of a habit, a discipline, a training that says, oh Lord, I need more grace. I need more mercy. I'm dealing with some really tough stuff. And Lord, your heart is to reveal more of yourself, your glory, your compassion, your love, your holiness, your righteousness in the midst of my lack. Oh God, that I would meet with you individually and that I wouldn't forsake assembling together with other believers. Lord, that we would remind each other, whether it's in homes or whether it's in a church building, Lord, that we are your people, sons and daughters of the living God. And you've invited us into communion. As you reminded us last week, to come to the table, that you are enough. And so, Lord, today, for everybody in this room, I pray for a fresh awareness, a fresh anointing, a fresh hunger and thirsting for righteousness, which is your presence, oh God. That we would experience more what we already know, and Lord, you'd reveal more from your truth as well. Here's our heart. May we seek what is true. Let's just close this time prayerfully singing this song. Make it the cry of your heart. Here's the seed of my affection. Here's my heart, God. Speak what is true. Sing it together.
Here's my heart, Lord. Here's my heart, Lord.
Here's my heart, Lord.
Here's my heart, Lord. Speak what is true, 'cause I am found.
Yes.
I am yours.
Yes, Lord.
I am loved. I'm made pure.
I have life. I can
breathe. I am healed.
I am
free. Here's
my heart. Here's my heart, Lord. Here's my heart.
Here's my heart, Lord.
So, may the Lord bless you. He's done the heavy lifting. He's entered in, taken on our suffering and our pain in our place. He has conquered death. The greatest fear we could ever have is of death, and He's abolished it in Him. Not apart from Him, in Him. So may we be people, certainly of His Word, but more of an allegiance to His Lordship. His Word is true, His Spirit is powerful, and He is King. I love Him. He loves me. I win. That works for you too, by the way. It comes from the heart. It doesn't come by ritual or rote or any tabernacle, but it comes from spending time, dwelling in His presence. Worship fortifies us for anything we're going to come across, and I believe that. May the Lord bless you, keep you, make His face shine upon you, that the world would know that He is King, and we're not. Amen? If you need prayer, we're going to be available. God bless you as you go. Let's go be the church that we're called to be.